Hi, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about working with English language learners in your classroom. So, obviously, this is a topic that comes up a lot anymore, and the question we want to answer first is why is this even important? Um, One of the big things that makes it so important is that the number of English language learners in our school, as well as across the country, is growing and is going to continue growing more and more each year. Um, and beyond that, even if it wasn't growing, as teachers, we should all hope that and strive that every student can have the best education possible, have the opportunity to learn, um, and be given an education that helps them do that. Additionally, in Kentucky, they're part of our GAP group for K-Prep, and they also, this is something a lot of teachers don't know, is they take a test every January called the Access Test. It's an English proficiency test, but it looks at English across content areas, and we're responsible for them improving on that test every year. And they take that every January. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is what's called language acquisition, how students acquire language, specifically a second language, which would be English. And that's always done a lot more easily if the student has a strong background in their first language. So a lot of times there's a perception that instruction should only be done in English and that the more English you expose the student to, the better. But sometimes that can actually be a detriment if their first language isn't fully developed. For example, if they are in a preschool and they don't know their colors in Spanish, it's going to be a whole lot harder for them to learn their colors in English. Whereas if they already know that that particular color is rojo, they can translate that to red a lot more easily. And this isn't always possible with younger students, but literacy in a first language is always desirable because it helps them with the skills they need to read and do stuff in the classroom. There's also a theory called the theory of transfer that says that content knowledge and skills from another language will transfer into English as soon as they learn the vocabulary. So if a student knows how to multiply in Spanish, a student should be able to easily multiply in English. So anytime native language instruction can be done, it's beneficial for the student so that they can continue learning content while they learn English. Now, obviously, I know that most teachers don't speak two languages, but one area where this would be beneficial is if the parent is working with the student at home in their first language, and then the teacher's working with the student at school in English. So that's something that should be encouraged, not discouraged. For example, if you have a student learning to read, they can practice reading in Spanish at home and in English at school. That way they're getting practice in both languages. Another thing that is important with language acquisition is that it sometimes seems like a student has fully acquired a language or they're fluent in a language, but that's not always the case. So just because a student can have a conversation in, say, the lunchroom or on the playground with their classmates doesn't necessarily mean that they have what they need to perform in the classroom. Basically, conversational English takes about 2 maybe 3 years to master max, but academic language can take anywhere from 5 to 7 years. So while they may be able to talk about something that they did last night, they can't usually use the vocabulary they may need for a science test. Some strategies for working with English language learners in your classroom include some of the following ideas. Obviously, use easy to understand language when you're giving instructions to them, and keep it as simple as possible. Additionally, if they're still very new at English, it'd be very beneficial to model directions for them. Text-rich environments are important for all students, but especially English language learners. You can use word walls, you can use posters, you can have lots and lots of books in your room, lots of different options for them to be exposed to constant text. Something that is really important once again, for all students, but especially English language learners, is to put an emphasis on content vocabulary. If you emphasize, say, 5 words that are vocabulary words from a certain lesson you're teaching that day, it's going to help them retain that information a whole lot better. And that kind of carries into the next thing of including language objectives in your lesson plans. All this is an extra step. If you have a lot of English language learners in your class, it's going to be beneficial for them because they're going to be able, if you give an objective that they need to be able to do with the language in addition to the content, you're going to be able to keep yourself and them accountable for those. So, for example, it may be in a lesson on weather, you may have a language objective about student can discuss 3 different types of weather. So that way you're including that constant language in there too. Another idea is to assign students a peer to work with. That can be a peer that speaks the same language as them, the same or first language as them, or it can just be a student in the class that can help them out and answer questions when they have questions. Some other things you can do are provide visuals. If you have a homework assignment, you can provide visuals that go along with it, or scaffolds such as graphic organizers and outlines and stuff that they can use for assignments. Maybe even a picture dictionary or something like that. You can also provide direct instruction on skills that they would need in the classroom, such as note-taking, brainstorming, even organizing a backpack. Things that are going to help them be a lot more successful in the classroom. Something else to be mindful of, especially in classes like social studies classes, is think about their prior knowledge and be mindful of those gaps that they might have. So if they don't understand what a democracy is because they came from a country that didn't have that, be sure to explain that. Another thing you can do that's kind of the opposite of that is use their cultural backgrounds as an asset for your instruction. So if a student grew up in a country that has different types of foods or different types of clothing, different traditions and holidays, maybe pull those in and have them talk about those when it's appropriate in the classroom and help them kind of become the teacher to their classmates. It'll give them a lot of worth and it'll help also broaden the diversity of the classroom. And for all students, but especially for ELLs, you need to always maintain high expectations. Just because they're learning English still does not mean that they shouldn't be expected to learn the content. So always keep your expectations high and try not to slip into the trap of expecting less of them because they may not have mastered English yet. Another thing I want to talk to you about is an organization called WIDA. WIDA is an organization that started off with a few different states, Wisconsin, Delaware, Idaho, I believe, and now it's been joined by about 30 states, one of which is Kentucky. And the goal of the organization is to ensure the success of English language learners. So they do a couple of things, particularly for Kentucky. One of the things is they're the company that makes the access test that I referenced earlier. That test is a test that checks English through reading comprehension, writing abilities, listening abilities, and speaking abilities. And it's throughout the content areas. Students take that every January, and they're accountable for increasing at least 1 point every year in their overall score, and that's on a 6-point scale. So that's part of our accountability. Additionally, they have a set of standards that teachers can refer to. These aren't concrete standards like the standards we're held to by the state, like the NGSS standards or Common Core. They're more suggestion example type of standards that you can refer to and create your own language objectives based on those standards. So here's how you would use those. When you get back a student's access scores, which you should be able to get at the beginning of each school year from last year's scores, the students are going to have a score from 1 to 6 in each area: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And then they'll have an overall score. Based on that score, you take those levels and look at the standards to see what they should be able to do based on their grade level and the subject that you're teaching them or working with them in. To find these standards, you can go to the website, the WIDA website. There's a free download. If you click on Downloads, Library, 2007 ELP Standards, and then for elementary ELP Standards for pre-K through 5th grade. You'll get a PDF of all the standards for those grade levels in each subject. Here's an example of what this would look like. You have the levels across the top, which is what would come from their score report. Most students in our school are going to be probably level 2 or above. By the time they get to level 5, they're borderline about to move out of the ESL program. So you would take their level and look at that level and maybe the next level up, and that's some examples of what they should be able to do in the topics that they're covered in that subject. So this is a sample of first and second grade social studies. So some things that might be talked about in first and second grade social studies would be community workers. For example, if a student is a first grader talking about community workers and they're level 3 for their language, they should be able to describe encounters or interactions with community workers in illustrated scenes. Okay, so that's kind of how that would work, but you can kind of adapt that to the content that you're teaching based on these ideas. So that's kind of all I had to talk to you about today, but I just want to challenge you that, just like Dr. Seuss says in the Lorax, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. And that's the reality for English language learners. If their classroom teachers don't care to go the extra mile to help them succeed, then they're going to continue to struggle and have a hard time learning the content, as well as language. So I just challenge you to take some of these ideas, and if you have English language learners now, use them with these students, and if not, kind of file them away for the future when you do have English language learners in your classroom. Thank you so much for your time.